If I told you Mei Symmetra was being played in the Big 2025, would you believe me? Mei and Sim are some of the joint lowest picked characters in the game, yet one of the best teams in Europe pulled both of them out and won in the high stakes match this year. But how did they do it? Well, good for you, I've created a 3-step explanation as to why, which I'm gonna trademark as Ice Splice. Inspired by the GOATs. First though, the team who pulled out this combo, Alcadia, only pulled out the Sim Mei twice. The first time on Dorado, which didn't go that well, and the second time on Havana, which secured them the win and their place to the Champions Clash in China. Note how they only pulled out the Strat when the enemy team were playing D.Va Ana, which is vital for 2 reasons, leading to my first layer, split TPs. Firstly, Mei and Sim can both damage D.Va through her matrix, which seems kinda obvious, but this means that D.Va can barely hold any space at all. Secondly, because of Ana's lack of mobility, it makes it super easy to place down a TP onto her, which she can't do much about. Other supports like Kiriko or Juno can maneuver around the TP, but she can't. This is where that Ice Splice name comes from. The ice refers to freezing and beaming down the enemy D.Va, and the splice comes from splitting the enemy team with your TP. Speaking of Ice Spice, comment down below who you think is thicker, Ice Spice or Mei. I know which one I'm choosing. In the very first fight, we see a pretty good example of how the Ice Splice combo works. Because the Ana is super far back, and because Checkmate hasn't got that TP range perk, which increases your TP range by 50%, Checkmate TPs to the high ground. In this comp, only the D.Va goes through. This is to allow the Sim and Mei to stay main and burn the D.Va when walking forwards. Meanwhile, Ziad's only job is to stall and draw aggro, make as many people look at him as possible so the Mei Sim can walk safely. After he boosts out and lands back on the high ground, KSA and Kevster both drop, meaning Sky's the only one left on the high ground. From there on, it's super easy for Ziad to burn him and force Sky off. From here, KSA starts to get frozen by the Mei, forcing him to boost out. Kevster also gets warded off, forcing him to dash out in order to live. Afterwards, Checkmate puts down another TP in the same fashion. Ziad goes through and tries to draw as much aggro as possible, this time forcing out Kai on the Sojourn and just missing out on killing Kevster. All this space creation allows Checkmate to walk and beam KSA, forcing him to boost it back once again. Now you're starting to see how this comp and how this cycle actually works. However, straight after, you start seeing the downsides. To put it simply, if you don't get enough value after you use Sim TP, Mei Wall and D.Va boosters, then that gives a window for the enemy team to push back onto you. That pretty much happens here, as KSA easily boosters into Checkmate with Kai finishing off the kill. Things do go better for the Sim main next fight though. Landon pops the Hyper Ring to help Alcadia cross the open space, and Ziad pretends to fly onto Kai before turning around and baiting 3 people to pull back. Ziad does these pretend boosters a lot, which I'm gonna call booster baiting. Pretending like you're gonna commit to something in the first half of your boosters, but then doing something entirely different for the second half. We saw Ziad do this last fight. Pretending like he's flying away from the high ground, but actually coming back afterwards, which as a result, baits KSA to drop. He does an even higher level example for later, so stay tuned for that. Anyways, back to Havana. Ziad gives Checkmate an opening to put a TP onto Twilight, which Ziad goes through in an attempt to blow up the Ana. The amount of aggression Ziad draws here is kind of insane. The Sojourn, D.Va, Genji and Brig are all looking at Ziad, which just gives so much space for the Sim Mei to walk. Lupta gets a great wall as well to cut off the D.Va Genji too, and now the ultimates are fucked. They do try to push back with the overclock, but Ziad is already on top of it, and while he doesn't kill the Sojourn, he draws the Brig's attention. At this point, the Sim Mei are just freely beaming the shit out of KSA, and the fight is basically over. Even though Twilight pops Nano Boost onto Kevster, Landon responds with Orbital Ray, officially ending the fights. These fights so far can be boiled down to D.Va drawing aggro, either by booster baiting or by teleporting through, both of which allowed the Sim Mei to carry in the mid fights. This leads me onto the second layer of the comp, which is forcing points, and we saw a glimpse of that with Landon's Orbital Ray last fight. This fight, we see Alcadia move to the right side. The reason for this is because the building provides a lot of cover for the sim mate to walk safely, avoiding things like Sojin angles and Ana's nade, which, trust me, will become important later on. With that being said, the whole of Al-Qadsiya TP up to the high ground, and Twilight tries to find a nade, but because of the awkward stairway angle, he misses. Kevster pops the blade afterwards, forcing Haku's beat, as well as the Blizzard too. Not a great trade for Al-Qadsiya so far, but Ziad is able to force Guy's rally, who actually has to drop to the low grounds. While this chaos is going on, Checkmate finds Twilight, who needed to hit the sleep dart to live, but unfortunately, just like that Carti album, he misses. Meanwhile, KSA does his best Icarus impression, flying too close to the Blizzard to eat it, eventually getting frozen. From that point, you can see how hard it is for anyone to touch Al-Qadsiya when their ultimates start to get rolling. One thing I haven't mentioned too is the perks. Funnily enough, Checkmate takes the extra turret perk. Does seem odd, but because he's on the second point of Ivana, where the sightlines become a lot more enclosed, he doesn't really need the extra TP range. All the other perks, like Mace for example, are pretty self-explanatory. Now, with Kevster moving on to the Venture, this gives me a perfect segue to talk about the third layer of this comp, the counters. To understand this, we first need to look at the Ramattra ban from Al-Qadsiya. You see, Ramattra is the only tank in the game that can stand his ground if he gets walked on by a Symmetra Mei. Ryan will get his shield melted, and stuff like Fortify, Cardiac Overdrive, and Hazard's block are nowhere near as good as Ramattra's block in terms of defensive utility. So if you can't live against Symmetra Mei, you need to threaten the Symmetra Mei. Genji, the hero that's pretty much been meta, can't really do that. Deflect is useless into Simbeam or Maze Freeze. Venture on the other hand can threaten Symmetra Mei very easily just by burrowing, because they haven't got the mobility to escape Venture. Essentially, Venture's job is to zone away the enemy backline, and that doesn't just have to be the Symmetra Mei. In this fight, Kai hits a nice railgun onto the Juno and Kevster chases with the dash. He soon burrows in, and all he needs to do is zone the Juno away for a long time, which he does. Haku tries to come in for the rescue, but the damage is already done from Kai, who secures the kill. But let's take this analysis a step further. What should have Landon done? Well, it's simple. Out-rotate the Venture. This idea was taken from professional coach Capitology, but out-rotate means you move away from a flanker, such as Venture in this case, early in the fights. So here, Landon should have already out-rotated the Venture by playing the left side. Considering the last idea about forcing points, you could even sim-wall early to make this rotation easier, or Ziad can mark an angle for you. So we've seen how this comp works, how it doesn't work, and how to possibly overcome it. But Venture isn't the only issue you need to face. The map too makes a big impact. This couldn't be any more obvious than looking at Dorado's second point. When Al-Qadsiya finally managed to play underneath the high ground, get ready for another booster bait by Ziad. Firstly, notice how the enemy Ana and Sojin are playing split, with the Ana on high ground and the Sojin on low ground. This means the D.Va should only be able to mark one of these characters, not both. However, the booster bait covers both bases. Ziad initially flies to the high ground to mark the Venture Ana before dropping to mark the Sojin. If you're a D.Va player watching this is a skill you need to develop. This is how you mark multiple angles at once. While Ziad does his thing, Checkmate pops the TP on high ground to again draw attention before beaming Vestola. But this is where the map geometry makes it super hard for Al-Qadsiya. Because Vestola is able to just fly to the high ground and lose almost no space, it makes it hard for Al-Qadsiya to walk. Compare this with how on Havana, KSA is forced to fly backwards, but here on Dorado, Vestola is able to fly upwards. Now, it's time for the enemy team to push back in, which they do with a great nade from Gala, and unfortunately, Checkmate uses the wall too late. So, what do you do as Al-Qadsiya? Well, to put it simply, after Vestola flies back to the high ground, I then would have used the sim wall to keep forcing points, then either use the beats or Blizzard thereafter. This would have kept the momentum for Al-Qadsiya and given enough time for Checkmate to use his TP again. Lastly, keep in mind that Dorado 2nd is a pretty open map. This means it was actually a fairly common occurrence for Shockwave to find magic picks out of nowhere, which obviously halted Al-Qadsiya's push. Anyways, that's it for the video. If you don't already know, this channel got hacked recently, so any likes or comments for the algorithm would be greatly appreciated. Until next time.